Dune Part 2 has been set up to be a huge cinematic step when it comes to delivering on the things that were only introduced in the first movie, and things that many fans of the book are excited for when it comes to their adaptation. I've already talked about its potential from a filmmaking standpoint, but now it's time to go into the types of moments and other aspects that, if adapted right, could make this film go beyond what we expect and what we want it to achieve. This includes certain scenes, characters, and plot points that would fully deliver on everything Dune Part 1 set up. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the big moments that will most likely be featured in Dune Part 2, alongside how Denis Villeneuve will go about adapting these moments for the big screen. There will be spoilers from the back part of the original novel, so I would recommend not watching this video if you are someone who hasn't fully read Frank Herbert's book. But before I get into it, if you want to keep up to date on any of my content surrounding Dune Part 1, Part 2 and beyond, then don't forget to support this video by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. Also, feel free to check me out on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit and Instagram at Cortex Videos, which is all linked in the description below. But without further ado, let's dive into the adaptation of Dune Part 2. So in the second film of Denis Villeneuve's so far successful endeavour into the world of Arrakis, we can of course expect the second half of Herbert's iconic novel to be brought to life. Within this, we know the plot will primarily focus on Paul's rise to power among the Fremen and his upcoming rebellion against the Emperor Shaddam IV. In becoming the Kwisatz Haderach, there will be moments that will test his character and endanger his life along with the people closest to him. Alongside this, the Atreides family begins to expand, with Paul and Chani becoming romantically connected, just like his visions predicted, and Lady Jessica will finally give birth to her daughter, Alia Atreides, developing with incredible Bene Gesserit abilities. For all of us who've read the book, we know that this is just touching the surface of what Part 2 will bring story-wise, and the back half of the novel provides a thrilling, more plot-driven focus. But it also means that the scope will be bigger and the cast will expand, introducing the vital roles of the current Emperor and his daughter Princess Irulan, who later becomes Paul's wife. Then there's Paul's power-driven rival Feyd Rautha. Denis has stated that Feyd will be a very important character in Part 2, so we know this is all in fact coming and isn't just a supporting element to be worked around. Feyd will act as Paul's final opponent in a battle that will determine the fate of the universe, and it's likely that this will also serve as a great bit of symbolism when it comes to reflecting the fight with Jamis at the end of the first movie. Maybe we'll even get flashes of that fight during this one to fully display the path that has been taken by Paul throughout his journey. It would be a nice bit of reflection, but also symbolic of the most important steps being decided in fateful knife fights. And of course, hopefully the choreography of this action is just as epic as the golden armor vision in Part 1. But furthermore, in Part 2 we'll get a return of other supporting players such as Josh Brolin's Gurney Halleck, who as we know survived the invasion of Arrakis. Though we saw him storming into battle against the Harkonnens in the last film, it was left ambiguous, and Part 2 will potentially bring him into the smuggler role after the 2-year gap that I'll discuss later. What's clear is that there's a lot for the second film to cover and big moments it has to deliver on. But how could Denis approach them? Well, starting with the opening of the movie, I think we are going to get an introduction of the Emperor and Princess Irulan, along with the aspects that Part 1 changed in that film's opening moments. What I'm speaking of is the opening speech by Irulan that in the book involved her narrating a number of works chronicling the acts of Paul Muad'Dib. These appear as openers to sections in Frank Herbert's Dune, and with Chani getting the opening speech in the first film, it would only make sense that Irulan has one in the beginning of part 2, especially since her character will most likely be introduced and a big part going forward. I think this will move into scenes that give us the Emperor, and also ones that bring us back to Baron Harkonnen with his nephew Fade Rotha. There's a lot to cover in the second film, and introducing these power figures right from the get-go will fuel us with the added motivation for Paul come his violent journey to take them down. I think we'll learn of the Emperor trying to arrange for Irulan's marriage to the Baron's nephew Fade as part of the scheme to take down the Atreides. This would be a good prelude to the eventual marriage between Princess Irulan and Paul, which is eventually arranged in order to legitimize Paul's claim to the Golden Lion throne later on in the story. I think seeing all of this plotting and introducing these figures in an opening sequence is really the right path when it comes to giving equal screen time to the opposing forces. We also know that following this will be a return to Paul, Lady Jessica, Chani and the Fremen, more characters that Denis can build chemistry between in the first act of this second film. It's understandable that the story would slightly skip forward here so that Paul and Jessica have enough time to adjust to their new lives, and we could see that unfold after introducing the previously mentioned antagonists. It also allows Paul to gain more control over his growing powers as he transitions into his role as the leader of the Fremen. With Dune Part 2 set to release in just under 2 years' time, it makes complete sense that the filmmakers would also preserve the book's timeline in doing so, and make jumps where necessary. But then there's of course that obvious time jump that will be covered later on in regards to the Water of Life scene. And coming back to the opposing forces, in discussion of the Emperor, the Baron, and the other characters aligned with them, I think we all would predict that they will be getting much more screen time across this film as a whole. Although the Emperor provided the Baron with his legions of Sardaukar for his invasion of the desert planet, as we saw in the first part, he still tried to keep his involvement in the conflict a secret. This is also another perfect move by Denis Villeneuve, who clearly made that a choice of purpose, but also one that would allow Part 2 to explore the full extent of his plan. We will no doubt see epic Lord of the Rings style battles between the Fremen, the Harkonnens, and the Emperor's forces, but learning more about his and the Baron's schemes in the opening act of a second film will give a greater purpose and motivation to the story going forward. And though the Baron managed to evade dying in part 1, he will surely face it in the sequel. After all the terrible things the Baron did to Paul's family, he of course ends up being assassinated by Paul's sister and his own revealed granddaughter, Alia Atreides. However, this death will allow his nephew, Fade Rotha, to inherit his throne, setting him up as the final antagonist of this story. Having this as one of the central beats and not just making the appearance as a looming threat will allow the filmmaker the chance to fully deliver on multiple characters at the same time who situate around the Baron. With this comes more screen time from another character who was pushed to the sidelines in part 1. We know that Duke Leto's mentat, Thufir Hawat, played by McKinley Henderson, survived the Harkonnen invasion of Arrakis, and in the book, he was forced to serve the Baron as his new mentat after the death of Paita in the Poisoned Tooth scene. We know that he works to sabotage the Harkonnens from within, and seeing this plan unfold on screen with more of Hawat's character will bring that added layer of complexity situating within the famous pages. And the final character that will most likely get some more screen time too, mainly from an action point of view, is Rabban. He does of course have a brutal death, one that involves being decapitated by the Fremen people that he oppressed for so long. I don't know how much screen time he'll have, but a personal dream prediction would be a fight between Rabban squaring off against Gurney Halleck and Stilgar. This would of course still need to end with Rabban being killed by the Fremen, but having this beforehand or leading up to it would of course be great to see on screen and act as a good climax for the kind of roles these characters have had in this particular adaptation. We'll have to see, but I can only hope for something additional like this to really make these supporting players feel like they've left their mark on this universe, and especially in part 2. The next elements to discuss surround one of the bigger moments of part 2, along with the role of the Fremen people. Starting with that bigger moment, in the closing parts of the first film, Paul sees a Fremen figure riding a sandworm across the dunes of Arrakis, a hint to the audience that Paul will undertake that same kind of procedure in the second film. As we know, the Fremen will ride these giant sandworms into battle against the Harkonnen forces in order to liberate Arrakis and free the population. Denis Villeneuve has promised that he intends to bring this iconic scene to life on the big screen, the one where Paul has to master the art of worm riding in order to become the leader of the Fremen. He said, "It's going to be one of the most exciting and challenging scenes that I will do as a director. I know exactly how to do it. The way we approach it in the first part is just like a summoning. We see them riding in the distance, but the potential of worm riding is huge. Already with Timothée Chalamet, we have done a test for him, as we were making the first movie. There are shots that I didn't put in the movie, but it's so exciting." So already, you get a sense that Denis is going to be adapting this moment in a huge way, bringing all the grand visuals through cinematographer Greg Fraser and the immersive thumping sound of Hans Zimmer to the table too. It's a moment that I can't wait to see unfold on the big screen from a design perspective, and I think that rather than cutting between Jessica and Paul like in the book, this moment will fully focus on Paul's iconic steps to master worm riding and his feelings in that given moment. It's going to take a lot of planning, but based on Denis' words, I think we could be in for something quite outstanding with this sequence. And when it comes to the Fremen themselves, they will be the central backbone of this second part. Part 2 will initially feature a bigger role for Chani, and anybody who has read the books knows that there's so much more to explore and deal with regarding her character. She will be nearly as equal to the main character of Paul as he rises to the Emperor position. She is his lover, and while he will marry Princess Irulan, it is Chani who he really loves and goes on to have children with. So building that chemistry and fully placing Paul in sync with the Fremen as a whole, alongside his previously discussed worm riding, will be a huge priority. Expect all of this to take up most of the early runtime and be the central guide to everything going on afterwards. Hopefully it will push forward more greatly the challenging themes linked to Paul becoming a messiah, and Chani will likely be included in this transition very heavily. Let's just hope the film tackles all of this seriously and puts a big focus on the growth of their characters. And now we come to probably one of my most anticipated elements of Dune Part 2. This includes the Water of Life sequence and the introduction of Aaliyah. As us book readers know, Paul is able to have visions of the future, and in the second film, these visions will only grow more powerful after being exposed to the spice on the planet Arrakis. But he aims to strengthen these visions even more so. After he fails to see an attempt on Jessica's life, Paul drinks the Water of Life to enhance his abilities, but because this substance is poisonous to males, he ends up going into a coma for many weeks before awakening to his full strength. But this is where Lady Jessica and her unborn child come into the picture. Paul of course foresaw in part 1 that his mother was pregnant with a daughter who goes on to become a crucial character in the Dune story. In the Water of Life scene, we will see Jessica take part in the Fremen ritual in order to become their new Reverend Mother, and during these events, her unborn daughter is exposed to its properties, and Aaliyah Atreides is born powerful and aware. What we learn is that she has the mind of an adult in the body of a 2-year-old, maturing quickly with bright blue eyes because of her pre-birth exposure to the special water. She is called an abomination by the Bene Gesserit, and it becomes a complex issue for everyone close or involved with the child. Dune Part 2 will also likely depict when the child kills the Baron with the Gom Jabbar, alongside revealing the connection between them. Part 1 leaves these revelations out from the tent scene between Paul and Jessica, presumably to make things more personal in Part 2 between all the characters come the finale, and to keep the focus on Paul's steady awakening in the first film. But with this all laid out, how do I think Denis Villeneuve will adapt the Water of Life scene and Aaliyah in Dune Part 2? Well, it has the potential to be a scene that, for one, is very revealing, but also one that visually is psychedelic and spiritual in regards to the events and imagery put on screen. The first thing that comes to mind when thinking about how this scene will look is the Stargate sequence in Kubrick's 2001, in that the imagery can guide what is unfolding. All the stuff with Aaliyah can be developed on in the following scenes that take place 2 years later, but the process of the Water of Life scene and what the characters explain in the book can all be shown with imagery. It has the potential to be an iconic scene that really awakens the audience, just as it does the characters, and I think this scene will also be the one in which we find out that Aaliyah is the Baron's granddaughter, and all the other connections revealed. Since they didn't reveal this in the tent scene in Part 1, it would only make sense to do it here. I expect that this will be a big moment that has inventive filmmaking, poetic meaning, and reveals in regards to the story, the type of moments that defines this second film, and it could be used to transport the audience across the 2-year time gap too. It can be a somewhat transition that Denis uses through visual filmmaking, one that would hopefully feel seamless and not too jarring in regards to the time jump. It's a difficult task to make this feel seamless, but if the writing is as good as Part 1, then I'm sure they'll find a way to make this moment work. And finally, it's key that we don't leave out the conclusion to Part 2, a climax that the filmmaker will likely adapt very faithfully. In the novel, after defeating the Harkonnens and confronting the Emperor, Paul persuades him to give up his throne in exchange for his daughter, Princess Irulan, in marriage. This is hinted at in Part 1, with Paul arguing with Liet Kynes that this can end the Emperor's rule over the universe while preventing a war between the great houses. I can see the ending of Part 2 being one that isn't too joyous though, potentially concluding with a hint that Paul will lose control over the Fremen even though he gains the Imperium. We know of course that his legions in return wage a holy war across the universe, killing millions in his name, just as he foresaw in his visions in Dune Part 1. It does remain unclear how Denis will tackle such dark events, but I think this would be a good marker to leave on, especially if a third film does in fact happen. But as a second film in a trilogy, I think the ending of this film will overall showcase a good merging of chaos, action, and the foreshadowing of Paul. His rise and dark rule must be emphasised on, and the long choreographed set pieces for battle scenes don't need to be the primary focus. Yes, there will be epic battle scenes like the Golden Armor one we briefly saw a glimpse at in Part 1, but it will most likely be equally maintained with a focus on the profound philosophies, arcs, and drama it builds up. This is what makes some of the great trilogies in film history, something we also saw in The Lord of the Rings, and something that Denis would feel more attached to in making. And the ending of Dune and Dune Part 2's overall plot clearly order an increased scale of action, but moments that don't overdo it. It would risk losing the emotional depth that made the first film so great. I trust Denis as a filmmaker when it comes to his adaptation of this, and it would be unlike him to unload too much of the blockbuster popcorn. Still, he will have more fun this time around with the set pieces, in bringing a heightened scale to the battles, just in a way that complements the central themes, characters, and the main story arc. But that was my video discussing how Denis Villeneuve, his cast and crew could adapt the big moments in Dune Part 2. The science fiction director has of course expressed his excitement surrounding many of these aspects during the press tour for Part 1, but as he has also said, the challenge is to go back to this universe with new strategies in order to excite their creativity while making the second film. is essentially the kind of plan that makes the second part stay in continuity with the first, but also a move that brings its own tone as an individual movie at the same time. Villeneuve has hinted at more action, but of course this will be done in relation to his style of filmmaking, and it also won't leave out the important thematic questions about destiny, power, and messianic figures. And speaking of messiahs, Denis wants to make this into a trilogy, one that covers the second Herbert novel to round out the Paul Atreides story. With Dune Part 1 and Part 2 showcasing Paul's rise to power, a potential Dune Messiah film to round it all off would follow his fall from that. The director has quite obviously a long path and a huge task to pull all of this off, but the ambition is there, and like we have been discussing in this particular video, the material is primed to be adapted into something really special. We'll have to see, but thinking about some of these moments, characters, and plot points has me wondering how the filmmaker and his crew will bring it all to life. But let me know down below in the comment section what you are personally excited for surrounding Dune Part 2, alongside how you think Denis Villeneuve will go about adapting the project. For much more videos and news on Denis Villeneuve's Dune universe, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like rating and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.